We are working in the first file entitled South and West, and we are moving on from Native Americans into the Anglo settling of the West, which starts with the text box in slide number 27. And again, don't watch me, much more interesting to watch the slides to keep an eye on the PowerPoints. So, we are talking about the West. We are talking after the Civil War. This is the settling of the western half of the country, or most of the western half of the country. Where are we talking about? A very important line, the line of the 100th meridian. The meridians are the vertical north-south lines on the map, and the 100th meridian is very close to splitting Austin. If you want to find out where the 100th meridian is on a map, look for Austin, go a little bit west of there, and that's the 100th meridian. Where it actually comes in is right through the town of Junction, which is about 130 miles west of Austin. But Austin is close enough. If you split Texas, that's the 100th meridian. And we all know that Houston is a very different climate from El Paso or Alpine. Why is that? The 100th meridian is the line of rainfall. That is the line where you get 15 inches or less of rainfall annually per year. Why is that important? Because there is no agriculture. Not much grows with less than 15 inches a year, and that's in a normal year. Many years are drier. Okay, so the period we're talking about, the settling of the West, is right after the Civil War, 1865. It really ends, you can use 1900 as a good date, but about 1890, because by 1890, everything that is settleable has been settled in the West or explored. Now, some of it had been explored before, but nobody had lived out there, with a few exceptions. The Mormons had gone in the late 1840s. There had been trappers and explorers, but very few settlers west of the 100th meridian. This was an area, if you look at slides number 28 to 30, you know what I'm talking about immediately if you've ever driven through West Texas or the southwest part of America or Utah or Death Valley or any of those places. Look very, very different, even then around Austin, where we have a lot of trees. Certainly, that slide of the forest I actually took in Kentucky, but pretty much anything east of the Mississippi looks like that. You have dense forest, a lot of trees, a lot of undergrowth. When you get west of the 100th meridian, the trees get smaller and smaller and they disappear, and you have grasslands. So when settlers got a little bit west of the Mississippi, the trees disappeared, and this was not a terrain that Europeans had any experience with. They had grown up in a heavily forested area. They called it the Great American Desert for 150 years. People were convinced that you could not live out on the plains. For a long time, they were largely right. They didn't know how to do it. But this is one of the great expansions in American history because within a very short time, we settled half a continent. And there are very few cultures that have done this. This is one of the great moments in American history if you neglect the part where we wiped out Native Americans. But to settle that much land that quickly is a huge accomplishment. The only other culture that has come close to it, Australia did very quickly, but Australia is not settled. Most of Australia, think of Australia as a donut. It has green all the way around the edges, and the middle of Australia is a large desert, essentially. So they didn't really settle Australia, they skirted around the edges. The only other country that has come close to this, ironically enough, is Russia, where they expanded quickly all the way across Siberia and all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But again, a lot of that was not settled for a very long time. Neither are parts of our American West. But this has not happened very often in the history of civilization. So it is a great accomplishment. We talk about the good and bad in American history, and this is one of the highlight moments. Okay, so there are three main groups, slide number 31, that helped open up and settle the West, and I'm doing them more or less in chronological order. The text does them slightly differently. The miners, the ranchers, and finally the farmers. So slide number 32, 35, are the miners. You can see our typical image. There's a lot of stereotypes and a lot of myths about the West in American history, but our typical image of the miner is a little old guy with a donkey and a pick and a shovel and a sack of flour, and he's gone for a year at a time. Those guys were out there. They were the first miners. They did discover veins that had been unknown. Earlier in the first half of the class, I talk a lot about the Rocky Mountains, and the Sierra Nevadas are part of mountain chains that extend from Alaska all the way to the tip of South America, and they have gold and silver in those kinds of rocks. We found it. We found some of it slightly before the Civil War, most of it afterwards. That little guy with the pick and shovel is called a placer miner, Placer. Placer mining is basically, the way I remember it, is mining in place. He's the guy who goes out and he checks along the streams and he finds little gold deposits. It's very low tech. It obviously doesn't need much financial investment. It is a guy or two guys by themselves. They look for a good site. If they find gold, they quickly claim the land. And what happens to most of them is they die impoverished at the end. A few of them sold out later and became incredibly wealthy. Most miners just kept going on and looking for the next strike, because who came in? The minute gold is discovered, investors came in and bought them out, usually at very low prices. What happens is hard rock mining. Hard rock mining is the second step of mining. After you find the claim, you find the gold in the stream, you follow the gold deposits. When they stop, you know that's where the gold ends, and you start digging into the rock, and that's why it's called hard rock mining. This is tunneling underground, following the veins of the mineral that go into the rock. It is very labor intensive. It is very expensive. You need a lot of equipment. You need skilled technology. You need support services like food and supplies, a lot of money in that too. And it is totally an environmental disaster. Because what do they do with all the rock that they haul out of the mine? They dump it. And if you go to Colorado today, when I was in school there, we could go into the mountains and you could see, this is 150 years later, you could see on the hillsides, there used to be a mine, because all of the mine tailings or the waste rock was just dumped and left. What happens when it rains? Goes down into the streams, and heavy metals poisons the streams, poisons everything in it, also poisoned a lot of the miners who were working it. This just happened recently because there is still mining going on in the West. The dates, really a little bit before the Civil War. There is no ending date to mining because it's still happening, and particularly in Alaska, there is still active mining going on, but in many places in the West as well. Hard rock mining involves tunnels, which means you have to have the structural supports so the things don't collapse on top of your head. There's a really good picture of a bunch of miners in a tunnel that I wouldn't enter on a bet. The death rate among miners was the highest of almost any industry at the time. It is still in America one of the two most dangerous occupations, mining and agriculture, large animals and big machinery. Hydraulic mining was developed very quickly. There's a slide for that. Hydraulic meaning water mining, high pressure water hoses. They figured out instead of trying to dig into it, you could wash the cliff down with a high pressure water hose. Also an environmental disaster, clearly, because all of that rock ends up as waste into the nearest body of water, lakes and rivers. This just happened a couple years ago. There was a mine that had a pond where they were dumping all the stuff in, and the dam broke in a heavy rain, and all of the stuff from that retaining pond basically washed into, in western Colorado, the Animas River. It turned the river bright yellow for about 100 miles downstream. It killed absolutely everything in the river and around the river that came to drink. The water is now cleaner today, but what happened to all of the heavy metals that was in that waste? They are at the bottom of the river. And there's no way anybody can clean up 1,000 miles of the bottom of a river. So I would not be eating any fish out of the Animas River for the next 2,000 years or so. Some of those metals don't degrade for hundreds and hundreds of years. So this is a total environmental disaster. Besides the fact that gold is separated from the rock with mercury. And we all know mercury is a neurotoxin. Your brain eventually turns to jelly. So people who were working in mining got the rock out of the mine in big chunks. It was sent to that large factory-looking building, which was called a stamp mill, where literally you had great pistons that smashed the rock into tiny gravel. When it was made into tiny gravel, they ran mercury through it. And the mercury binds with gold. The gold came out, the rock was thrown away, and then the mercury was boiled off. This did not do very good things for the health of the people who were involved in this process at all. This is still going on firsthand in the Amazon today, too. This is not an old system at all. So once you have hydraulic mining or stamp mills or tunnels, you need a lot of investment. Huge profits, but huge investment required. So those poor little guys that we always think of as the little miners in the West, they did not become wealthy, the vast majority of them, and they didn't last too long. They were replaced by industrial mining. The first gold strike, of course, California, and you know the year because of the 49ers. So you know 1849, there is no end date. We are still actively mining in parts of the West, and particularly in Alaska, in western lands, in mountainous areas along the Pacific. The people who came to work in the mines, you mentioned gold, lots of people show up very quickly. You needed a lot of cheap labor again. Lots of immigrants, particularly those who had mining experience, they were recruited for this. So Germans and English who mined coal, South Americans who had experience with gold and silver mining, and Chinese who were also experienced in mining. They moved to a mining town or were recruited and lived in horrible conditions, usually because they are a mix of nationalities and a mix of languages. They separated out into very distinct groups. Very competitive. The goal is to get as much gold out as quickly as you can. So there's not much cooperation between these ethnic groups. There's a lot of violence because they're competing for a finite resource. They didn't like each other, a lot of ethnic strife, and a lot of violence. The towns are very democratic because there's no one else to make the rules for them. They were self-governing, but divided up into local communities and highly racist. The Germans hated the Poles, and the Poles didn't like the English, and nobody liked the South Americans, and everybody disliked the Chinese. The first immigration law we had was 1882, and it banned Chinese. And they were called Chinese. There were other Orientals there, but they didn't know the difference. So anybody who looked Oriental was called Chinese, and it banned Chinese immigration because the Chinese had quickly moved into the mining industry. Mining areas are urban areas. There's a map there that talks about urban states in the West. And how in the heck can you call places like Wyoming or Utah or Nevada urban states in the 1800s? Mining. Because people who were mining lived in small communities, they lived in mining towns. So most of their settlement is urban, is in towns. And that's why those states are urban. We never think of it. But originally they were largely urban states. So you have the miners. They are the first ones there. They start in 49. When they find gold in California, they immediately move all over and start looking for it elsewhere. The second group that comes are the ranchers. And 36 to 40 are the slides. The first slide is our typical Westerner, our stereotype of the cowboy. This is the great American hero. We're still making Western movies occasionally. Everybody overseas immediately thinks of cowboys as a symbol of America. From personal experience, if you tell people you're American, that's what they usually think of. Most foreigners know that we have 50 states, so they'll ask me, "Oh, you're American." They can tell from my accent. What state do you come from? And the minute I say Texas, you can guess what the next question is. And this is still happening on every trip I take. How many cows do you own? And do you ride your horse to work? That's still done. Many people overseas have seen Dallas or many of the Western movies, and that is their image of Texas. The irony of this is, although this is a huge mythic image for Americans, is the actual ranching and the actual cowboy as an occupation only lasted less than 20 years. From about 1870, after the end of the Civil War, by 1890, that is finished. There is no cowboy, really. This is a huge image. Even today in political campaigns, and watch and see, because we have political campaigns going on now, when you begin to see advertisements in Texas, I've made a study of this over the years I've been in Texas, people running for office always have a rural background in back of them in the film while they're talking. Check and see. And oftentimes they will have livestock like cattle or horses. That makes them look like a Texan, which is, for Texans and most Americans, a very positive image. So what area are we talking about? The 100th meridian. West of the 100th meridian, this is the high plains, the sea of grass. This is short grass prairie. It's a lot worse today than it was then. I will talk about this when we talk about the Dust Bowl. But when the early Spanish explorers went through, they talked about grass coming to the stirrups of their horses as they rode through on horseback. It's much shorter today, but this is basically the land of little rain, less than 15 inches a day. Who are we talking about? We are talking literally cowboys. These are boys. You had to have cheap workers, anything from 15 to 20 years old. The death rate, incredibly high. If you want a really good movie dealing with the cattle drives and cowboys, Lonesome Dove. It was a mini series about 20 years ago. The subtitle of Lonesome Dove, it's a Texas cattle drive. The subtitle should be 1,000 Ways to Die on a Cattle Drive, which was not much exaggeration. Boys, many of them died or were crippled. You have 1,000-pound animals that you have to control, so not an easy job. Some of them made enough money to go and buy ranches later or to buy a farm. Most of them ended up the rest of their lives working for other ranchers. Everything about the Texas cattle industry and the cattle industry in the United States was adopted wholesale from Texas. We exported this around the world. And of course, Texas adopted it completely from Mexico and Latin America, from the Spanish. The equipment, the stock, the animals themselves, the methods, the terms. Think of the terms used in rodeo, the word rodeo itself, latigo, remuda, corral. The whole thing is adopted wholesale from the Spanish. So unlike mining that moves west, started in California, and moves east into the Rockies, the cattle industry starts in Texas in the south and moves north. Within 20 years, it has moved all the way into Western Canada. These young guys, you have a lot of ex-Confederates who were pretty footloose and looking for something to do and wanted out. You have a good number of ex-slaves or free African American males. Your options were pretty slim, as we talked about after the Civil War. You could stay and become a sharecropper. One of the options was to go west and become a cowboy. This, unlike the mining towns, being a cowboy, ranchers and the whole cowboy industry was very non-racist. The goal was cooperation, not competition, because you have to, a small group of guys, a dozen guys, have to get 1,000-pound animals over hundreds of miles. If you don't cooperate, you're all dead. So cooperation as opposed to competition in the mining frontier. So you have um, black cowboys, a good number of them, and you have a very large number, not surprisingly, of Hispanics because the industry started in Texas and spread throughout the West. And they know the industry and taught it to everybody else. So there's a lot of minorities here and very little conflict. Why get into this? There were huge profits to be made after the Civil War. First of all, once the Native Americans are put on reservations and the bison are slaughtered, you have millions, tens of millions of acres of free grass, of unfenced rangeland, grassland. All you had to do was buy a young calf or a cow in Texas, and there were 4 million at the end of the Civil War, many of them unbranded because the guys were gone for 4 years. Cattle were pretty much left to run in Texas. By 1865, there's millions of cattle in Texas. The going price was $5 for a young, healthy 6-month-old calf that was through drinking from its mother. And if you could take it north to the railway and ship it, you could get for that $5 calf $40 in Chicago, $69 in New York City, and $86 in Massachusetts. So when the railway starts when the cattle industry starts is when the railway comes through, because driving cattle from Texas, Austin, Texas, to Chicago would take 6 months or more. Walk behind a cow sometime and see how fast it walks. It's about 2 miles an hour. Getting them from Austin, Texas to Kansas took 2 to 3 months. That's doable, and you don't have to worry about the winters. Put them on the railway. Within 24 hours, they're in Chicago. Within 36 hours, they're in New York City or Massachusetts. So there's tremendous profits to be made. They figured out the average profit margin was 33% a year. If you could give me those kind of returns on money, everybody would be investing in that bank today, because the returns on your money today are less than 1%. The railroads made it possible. The first railroad connected in Abilene, Kansas in 1867. It's not surprising that the state of Texas granted millions of acres to Chicago railway companies to build railways, because they knew you couldn't drive cattle that far without the railways. Texas alone, in the 20 years that the cattle drives existed, Texas alone sent close to 5 million cattle to eastern markets. There was somebody figured this out, the Loving Goodnight Trail